О, привет. Стивен, Паш, ты снова первый. Прикольно. Мой утренний... О, привет, Эдвард. Мое утреннее чтение превратилось в дневное чтение. Сергей, привет. Ну, я что-то как-то решила сделать, потому что тогда все домашние дела и почитать, и потом уже заниматься учебой и всем таким, потому что, просто если я буду сейчас учиться и потом буду вечером волноваться по поводу того, я же еще вроде как читать собиралась, лучше все хотелки сейчас сделать и потом уже спокойно сесть и заниматься своими делами дальнейшими. Даже пирожок на завтрак почти испекла. То есть я не стала его сейчас ставить, хотя можно было, потому что все равно еще целый час занималась всяким после того, как тесто заготовила. Ну да ладно. Потом. Пирожок на завтра. Привет, привет, привет. Вам слышно этого котика? Тиканье. Это не часы, это котик, потому что тут солнечно, как вы видите. Или, по крайней мере, достаточно солнечно, чтобы или достаточно светло, чтобы свет попадал на... О, Татьяна, привет. И Татьяна, привет. Чтобы свет попадал на этот самый, на сенсор, и он, такой... Лапы машет. Сейчас еще чуть-чуть подожду. Меня не слышно, ну ладно. Он довольно громко тикает, на самом деле, хорошо. Хорошо. Тогда я постараюсь на него не отвлекаться. Раз он все равно его не слышно. А ты, Сергей, на работе сегодня? Окей, ладно. Ну да, точно. Вроде говорил, что воскресенье рабочий, потом понедельник не рабочий, как-то так. У Евы сегодня тоже вроде как рабочий день. Тот стрим, где, в принципе, не надо ничего смотреть, может просто слушать и вот. И радоваться, надеюсь. Добрый день всем! И своими делами заниматься. Хорошего рабочего дня тогда. У нас тут солнышко. Вот. Как солнышко? Облачно, солнечно, как-то так. Вчера было симпатичнее. В смысле, вчера было очень-очень-очень солнечно. Сегодня все не так. Вот еще колокола. Да, он там на полочке колокола за этим самым, за окном. Могу, в принципе, пойти показать, что как, пока ждем. Сейчас. Сегодня этих... переключись, спасибо. Вот. Сегодня сирен не будет, потому что сегодня воскресенье, но зато есть колокола. Вот. Там где-то внизу, за елками. Кстати. Вон, там, в принципе, между елками даже видно ее. И та тоже гремит. И там тоже, скорее всего, где-то что-то гремит, но слышно вот эти две. Уф. Метель, мрак, не. Нет, спасибо. Не, ну я не исключаю, что в конце марта что-нибудь такое произойдет, или там в апреле, в начале апреля. Ну, не, у нас уже весна. Надеюсь, так и будет. А это, собственно, кот, который тикает. Откуда он? Из Гуанчжоу, по-моему. Или Шэньчжэня. Ну, по-моему, все-таки из Гуанчжоу. Ну, пускай рядом тогда уже стоит и тикает. Нет, стоп. Вот тут пускай стоит и тикает. А Сансарина тикает. Так хотя бы его будет видно иногда, наверное. Видно? Нет. А, да, видно. Что, хочешь сказать, тебе здесь света мало? Там тебе лучше было? Теперь уже не тикательно? Так. А так. Угу. Понятно. Окей. 12. Закроем. А тут лучше идите. Все. Че, кто-нибудь шел? Нет, никто? Ну ладно. Ну, потом потянется, наверное. Окей. У нас снова попытка догнать Дмитрия. 2 главы. Вроде как. А нет, стоп. А нет, да, 2 главы. Одна из огнедов в полымя, вторая про этого, про Бьорна. No one. Chapter 6. Out of the frying pan into... Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on and on, till the sun began to sink westwards, behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward, and could see before him, under the ridges and slopes falling toward lowlands, and the plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. Good heavens, he exclaimed. I seem to have got right into the other side of the I seem to have got right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I only hope to goodness that they are not still back there in the power of the goblins. He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge, and down to the slopes beyond. But all the while a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now he had the magic ring, go back into the horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it, when he suddenly heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins. So he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path, winding downwards with a rocky wall on the left hand. On the other side, the ground sloped away, and there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells, under the bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw peering between two big boulders a head with a red hood on. It was Balin doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on, for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. I will give them all a surprise, he thought, and as he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell, Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on with their journey, leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of goblins, without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. After all, he is my friend, said the wizard, and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him. The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, but why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. He has been more trouble than use so far, one said. If we have got to go back now into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then draft him, I say. Gandalf answered angrily. I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me to look for him, or I go and leave you here to get out of the mess as best as you can yourselves. If I can only find him again, you will thank me before all this is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory? You would have dropped him, said Dory, if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet, and kicked you in the back. Then why didn't you pick him up again? Good heavens! Can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there, and everything with Orcrist. All of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, "Follow me, everybody!" and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out of the lower door, and helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without our burglar, confiscate him. And here's the burglar, said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped! Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all of the others. He called to Balin and told him what he thought of a lookout man who lets people walk right into them like that without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar, in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, I just crept along, very carefully and quietly." Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted, said Balin. "And I take off my hood to you," which he did. "Balin, at your service," said he. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything except about the finding of the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition and shrugged most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. "And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me," ended Bilbo. "So I said, 'What's in my pocket?' And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, 'What about your promise? Show me the way out.' But he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. Then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped, and ran down to the gates." "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh yes, lots of them, but I dodged them, and I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons," he said sadly, looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he guessed that the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarfs, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all to go now, and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins, and in that part of the mountains. But their main gate used to come out in a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted near the gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken, quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up to now. "I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again," said Gandalf, "or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all." As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack, just as it snapped to. He followed after the dwarves and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was, he said. Touch and go. But, of course, Gandalf had made a specialist study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Tuke's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains. But it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. They made that gate ages ago, he said, partly for a way of escape if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come in the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They were guarded doubtfully after this. He laughed. Okay. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal. But they had killed the great goblin and a great many others beside. And they had all escaped, so they might be said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. "We must be getting on at once. Now we're a little rested," he said. "They will be out after us in hundreds when night comes on, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of moon, if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by." "Oh yes," he said in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. "You lose track of time until inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come right down through the heart of the mountains, and are now on the other side. Quite a shortcut, but we are not at the point to which our paths would have brought us. We're too far to the north and have some awkward countries ahead, and we're still pretty high up. Let's get on." "I'm dreadfully hungry," groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit! His stomach felt all empty and loose, and his legs all wobbly, and now the excitement was over. "Can't help it," said Gandalf. "Unless you like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage." "No, thank you," said Bilbo. "Very well, then. We must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves." As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat. But the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit on sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its bank, but it was not much good. They still went on and on. The rough path disappeared. The bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage and the myram, and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of the wide steep slope of fallen stones, the remnants of a landslide. When they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone went clattering down and started other pieces below them, slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them and below them seemed on to move, and they were sliding away, huddled all together in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. Вспомнился, о, привет, Тима Лихолесье. Вспомнился вчерашний поход со всеми сеточками, со всеми этими отводящими канальчиками от камушков. Вот там этого точно не хватает. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of the climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forest branches. From the deeper, darker forest of the valleys below. Some got hold in the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like a little hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from an onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over. The slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "Well, that has got us on a bit," said Gandalf. "And even goblins tackling us will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bomber, "but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy, and were rubbing their bruises and damaged legs and feet. "Nonsense! They are going to turn aside here out of the path of the side. We must be quick! Look at the light!" The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down, they could still see the evening lights on the plains beyond. They limped along now as fast as they were able. Along now as fast as they were able down the gentle slopes of the pine forest in a slanting paths leaning steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken with tall fronds rising right above the Hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quite as quiet over a floor of pine needles, and all the while the forest gloom got heavier and forest silence deeper. There was no wind that everything There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighting into the branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo, who, when it was so dark that he could see only just Must we go any further? Asked Bilbo, when it was so dark that he could only just see Thorin's beard wagging beside him, and so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, my legs are ache, and my stomach is waggling like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and was shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl away down the hill, a long, shrilling howl. It was answered by another away to the right and a good deal nearer to them, then by another not far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins' hole at home, but he knew that noise. he had had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins on the Took side, who had been a great traveller, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil packs that lived under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountains, over the edge of the wind, on the borders of an unknown. Wolves of the sort smell keener than goblins, and do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said, and it became a proverb, though we now say out of the frying pan into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. Up the tree... Господи! У меня тут гоблины, Малик, привет, спасибо, котик, что? Обратный билет. Ну, это самое общее описание, которое я не меняю. У меня тут, волки воют, хоббиты на деревья прыгают и котик. Окей, ладно. Можно на вкусняшки? Спасибо, Малик. Ой, Лен, привет. Кто еще? Стивен, Паша, Сергей, Татьяна. Народ совсем поздоровалась. Ну, у меня тут котик. Окей. Up the trees, quick! Cried Gandalf, and they ran to the trees at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low, or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as ever they could, you can guess. And up they went as high as ever they could trust the branches. You would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the trees, with their beards dangling down, like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing the like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Phil and Killy were at the top of a tall larch, like an enormous Christmas tree. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were more comfortable in a huge pine with regular branches sticking... Спасибо, Татьяна! Окей. Мне надо сделать этот звук потише, а то я так и буду прыгать каждый раз, когда кто-нибудь мне котика присылает. Вот. Да ничего, Елен, тут, как я уже говорила, просто слушать и не смотреть там не на что, ну вот на котика. Может, чуть-чуть на вид сзади или на маракую, которую, кстати, не хочется свести. Хотя я ее поливаю всяким удобрением, но что-то у меня как-то то цветет, то не цветет. Ну ладно, нет настроения. Так, ладно. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were more comfortable in a huge pine with regular branches sticking out at intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Bifur, Boffer, Bomber, and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a tall, slender fir with few branches, and were trying to find a place to sit in a greenery of the topmost spots. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree into which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peeped out. And Bilbo? He could not get into any tree, and was scuttling about from trunk to trunk, like a rabbit that has lost its hole and had a dog after it. "You've left the burglar behind again," said Nori to Dori, looking down. "I can't be always carrying burglars on my back," said Nori. "Down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin. for there were howls all around them now, getting near and near. Dory, he called, for Dory was lowest down in the easiest tree. Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up. Dory was really a decent fellow, in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arm down as far as ever he could. So Dory actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Just at that moment, the wolves trotted howling into the clearing. All of a sudden, there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still, Dory did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had climbed off his shoulders into the branches, and then he jumped for the branches himself, only just in time. A wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up, and nearly got him. In a minute, there was a whole pack of them yelping all around the tree and leaping up at the trunk with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild wargs, for so the evil wolves of the edge of the wilds were named, cannot climb trees. For a time they were safe. Luckily it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time, but in the cold and the wind, with wolves all around below waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. This glade in the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place for the wolves. More and more kept coming in. They left guards at the foot of the tree in which Dory and Bilbo were, and then went snuffing about till they had smelled out every tree that had anyone in it. These they guarded too, while all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in a great circle in the glade, and in the middle of the circle there was a great grey wolf. He spoke to them in the dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it, Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, and as if all their talk was about cruel and wicked things, as it was. Every now and then, all the wargs in the circle would answer their grey chief all together, and their dreadful clamour almost made the whole Hobbit fall off of his pine tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from their mountains unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes, or are marching to war, which I am glad to say has not happened for a long while. But in those days they sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. Then they often got the wargs to help and share the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men on horses. Now it seemed that the great goblin raids had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin, and all the excitement caused by the dwarfs and Bilbo and the wizard, for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had of late been making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in among the more pleasant woods in the valleys and along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dared not attack them if there were many together, or in the bright day. But now they had planned, with the goblins' help, to come by night upon some of the villages nearest to the mountains. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left there. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left there next day. All would have been killed except the few the goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. This was dreadful talk to listen to, not only because the brave woodmen and their wives and children, but also because of the danger which now great threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them here in their very meeting place. They thought they were friends of the woodmen and were come to spy on them, and would take news to the plan of their plans down into the valleys, and then the goblins and the wolves would have to fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people wakened suddenly from their sleep. So the wargs had no intention of going away and letting the people up the trees escape. At any rate, not until morning. And long before that, they said, goblin soldiers would be coming down from the mountains, and goblins can climb trees or cut them down. Now I can understand why Gandalf, listening to their growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid, wizard though he was, and to feel that they were in a very bad place and had not yet escaped at all. All the same, he was not going to let them have it at their own way, though he could not do very much stuck up in a tall tree with wolves all around on the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of the tree. Then he set one alight from bright blue fire and threw it whizzing down among the circle of the wolves. It struck on the one on the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire, and he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. Then another came, and another, one in blue flames, one in red, another in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle, and went off in colored sparks and smoke. An especially large one hit the she-wolf onto the nose, and he leaped in the air 10 feet, and then rushed round and round in the circle, biting and snapping even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves was terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled all the forest. Wolves are afraid of fire at all times, but this was a most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got in their coats, it stuck and burned into them, and unless they rolled over quick, they were soon all in flames. Very soon, all about the glade wolves were rolling over and over to put out the sparks on their backs, while those that were burning were running about howling and setting others alight, till their own friends chased them away, and they fled off down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water. "What is all this uproar in the forest tonight?" said the Lord of the Eagles. He was sitting black in the moonlight, on the top of a lonely pinnacle of the rock at the eastern edge of the mountains. "I hear wolves' voices. Are the goblins at mischief in the woods?" He swept up into the air, and immediately 2 of his guards from the rocks at either hand leaped up to follow him. And they circled up in the sky and looked down upon the ring of the wargs, a tiny spot far, far below. But eagles have keen eyes and can see small things at a great distance. The Lord of the Eagles of the Misty Mountains had eyes that could look at the sun unblinking, and could see a rabbit moving on the ground a mile below, even in the moonlight. So, though he could not see the people in the trees, he could make out the commotion among the wolves, and see the tiny flashes of fire, and hear the howling and yelping come up faint from far beneath him. Also, he could see the glint of the moon on goblin spears and helmets, as long lines of the wicked folk crept down the hillside from their gates and wound into the wood. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel. But the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back to their caves, and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from their mountains. Tonight, the Lord of the Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot. So he summoned many other eagles to him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly, circling ever round and round, they came down for the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing too. Dreadful things had been going on down there. The wolves that had caught fire and fled into the forest had set it alight in several places. It was high summer, and on this eastern side of the mountains there had been little rain for some time. Yellowing brackens, fallen branches, deep piled pine needles, and here and there dead trees were soon in flames. All round the clearing of the wargs, fire was leaping, but the wolf guards did not leave the trees. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling round the trunks, and cursing the dwarves in their horrible language, with their tongues hanging out and their eyes shining as red as the fire and fierce as the flames. When suddenly goblins came running up, yelling. They thought a battle with the woodmen was going on, but they soon learned what had really happened. Some of them actually sat down and laughed. Others waved their spears and clashed the shafts against their shields. Goblins are not afraid of fire, and they soon had a plan which seemed them most amusing. Some got all the wolves together in a pack. Some stacked fern and brushwood round the tree trunks. Others rushed round and stamped and beat the stamped until the others rushed round and stamped and beat and stamped until nearly all the flames were put out. But they did not put out the fire nearest to the trees where the dwarfs were. That fire they fed with leaves and dead branches and bracken. Soon they had a ring of smoke and flame all round the dwarfs, a ring which they kept from spreading outwards, but it closed slowly in, till the running fire was licking the fuel piled under the trees. Smoke was in Bilbo's eyes. He could feel the heat of the flames, and through the reek he could see the goblins dancing round and round in a circle that like people round a midsummer bonfire. Outside the ring of dancing warriors circle like uh, outside the ring of dancing warriors, with spears and axes, stood the wolves at a respectful distance, watching and waiting. He could hear the goblins beginning to a horrible song. 15 birds and 5 trees, their feathers were fans in a fiery breeze. But funny little birds, they had no wings. Oh, what shall we do with the funny little things? Roast them alive or stew them in a pot, fry them or boil them and eat them hot. Then they stopped and shouted out, "Fly away, little birds, fly away if you can. Come down, little birds, or you will get roasted in your nest. Sing, sing, little birds, why don't you sing?" "Go away, little boys," shouted Gandalf in answer. "It isn't bird nesting time. Also, naughty little boys that play with fire get punished." He said it to make them angry and to show them he was not frightened of them, though of course he was, wizard though he was. But they took no notice and went on singing. "Burn, burn, tree and fern, shiver and scorch, a fizzing torch, to light the night for our delight. Yah! Bake and toast them, fry and roast them, till beads blaze and eyes glaze, till hair smelts and skin in cinders lie beneath the sky. So dwarves shall die and light the night for our delight. Yahai, hari, yahoy! And with the yahoy, the flames were under Gandalf's tree. In a moment, it spread to the others. The bark caught fire, the lower branches cracked. Then Gandalf climbed to the top of his tree. The sudden splendor flashed from his wands like lightning, and as he got ready to spring down from the high right among the spears of the goblin, that would have been the end of him, though he would probably have killed many of them as he came hurtling down like a thunderbolt. But he never leaped. Just at that moment the Lord of the Rings swept down from above, seizing him in his talons, and was gone. There was a howl of anger and surprise from the goblins. Loud cried the Lord of the Eagles, to whom Gandalf had now spoken. Back swept the great birds that were with him, and down they came like huge black shadows. The wolves yammered and gnashed their teeth. The goblins yelled and stamped with rage, and flung their heavy spears into the air in vain. Over them swooped the eagles, and the dark rush of their beating wings smote them to the floor or drove them far away. Their talons tore at goblin faces. Other birds flew to the treetops and seized the dwarfs, who were scrambling up now as far as they ever dared to. Poor little Bilbo was very nearly left behind again. He just managed to catch hold of Dory's legs as Dory was borne off last of all, and up they went together above the tumult and the burning. Bilbo swinging in the air with his arms nearly breaking. Now, far below, the goblins and the wolves were scattering far and wide in the woods. A few eagles were still circling and sweeping above the battleground. The flames about the trees sprang suddenly up above the highest branches. They went up in the crackling fire. There was a sudden flurry of sparks and smoke. Bilbo had only escaped just in time. Soon the light of the burning was faint below, a red twinkle on the black floor, and they were high up in the sky, rising all the time in strong sweeping circles. Bilbo never forgot that flight. Clanging into Dory's ankles, he moaned, "My arms! My arms!" But Dory groaned, "My poor legs! My poor legs!" At the best of times, heights made Bilbo dizzy. He used to turn queer if he looked over the edge of quite a little cliff. And he had never liked ladders, let alone trees, never having had to escape from wolves before. So you can imagine how his head swam now when he looked down between his dangling toes and saw the dark lands opening wide underneath him, touched here and there with the light of the moon in the hillside, rock or a stream in the plains. The pale peaks of the mountains were coming nearer, moonlit spikes of rock sticking out of the black shadows. Summer or not, it seemed very cold. He shut his eyes and wondered if he could hold on any longer. Then he imagined what would happen if he did not. He felt sick. Тут картиночка есть. The misty mountains looking west from the eye towards Goblin Gate. Вот. Кстати, мне интересно, если нажать... Нет, если я нажму на ссылку на картинку, меня перенесет в конец книги, и тогда я снова начну искать, где я. Кто у нас присоединился? О, Юля, приветствую. Ева, добрый день. О, картиночка. Спасибо. Так. У нас тут орлы и гномы в воздухе, и Бильбо думают, удержится, не удержится. Что же будет дальше? Вы, конечно же, забыли, что было на прошлой неделе. The flight ended only just in time for him, just before his arms gave way. He loosed Dory's ankles with a gasp and fell into the rough platform of an eagle's eyrie. Наверное. There he lay without speaking, and his thoughts were a mixture of surprise at being saved from the fire and fear lest he had fallen off that narrow place into the deep shadows on the other side. He was feeling very queer indeed in his head by this time, after the dreadful adventures of the last 3 days, with next to nothing to eat, and he found himself saying aloud, "Now I know what a piece of bacon feels like when it is suddenly picked out of the pan on a fork and put back onto the shelf." "No, you don't," he heard Dory answering, "because the bacon knows that it will get back into the pan sooner or later, and is to be chopped and and it is to be hoped we shan't. Also, eagles aren't forks." "Oh no, not a bit like storks' forks, I mean," said Bilbo, sitting up and looking anxiously at the eagle who was perched close by. He wondered what other nonsense he had been saying, and if the eagle would think it rude. You ought not to be rude to an eagle when you are only the size of a hobbit and are up in his eyrie at night. The eagle only sharpened his beak on a stone and trimmed his feathers and took no notice. Soon another eagle flew up. "The Lord of the Eagle Birds, The Lord of the Eagle bids you to bring your prisoners to the great shelf," he cried, and was off again. The other seized Dory in his claws and flew away with him into the night, leaving Bilbo all alone. He had just strength to wonder what the messenger had meant by prisoners, and to begin to think of being torn up for supper like a rabbit when his own turn came. The eagle came back, seized him in his talons by the back of his coat, and swooped off. This time he flew only a short way. Very soon Bilbo was laid down, trembling with fear, on a wide shelf of rock on the mountainside. There was no path down onto it, save by the flight, and no path down off it except by jumping over the precipice. Over a precipice. Okay. There he found all others sitting with their backs to the mountain wall. The Lord of the Eagles also was there and was speaking to Gandalf. It seemed that Bilbo was not going to be eaten after all. The wizard and the Eagle Lord appeared to know one another slightly, and even to be on friendly terms. As a matter of fact, Gandalf, who had often been in the mountains, had once rendered a service to the Eagles and healed their lord from an arrow wound. So you see, prisoners had meant prisoners rescued from the goblins only, and not captives of the Eagles. As Bilbo listened to the talk of Gandalf, he realized that at last they were going to escape really and truly from the dreadful mountains. He was discussing plans with the great eagle for carrying the dwarves and himself and Bilbo far away and setting them down well on their journey across the plains below. The Lord of the Eagles would not take them anywhere near where men lived. They would shoot at us with their great bows or few, he said, for they would think that we were after their sheep, and at other times they would be right. No, we are glad to cheat the goblins on their sport, and glad to repay our thanks to you, but we will not risk ourselves for dwarves in the southern plains. Very well, said Gandalf. Take us where and as far as you will. We are already deeply obliged to you, but in the meantime we are famished with hunger. I am nearly dead of it, said Bilbo in a weak little voice that nobody heard. That can perhaps be mended, said the Lord of the Eagles. Later on you might have seen a bright fire on the shelf of rock, and the figures of the dwarves round it, cooking and making a fine roasting smell. The Eagles had brought up dry boards for fuel, and they had brought rabbits, hares, and a small sheep. The dwarves managed all the preparations. Bilbo was too weak to help, and anyway he was not much good at skinning rabbits or cutting up meat, being used to having it delivered by the butcher, all ready to cook. Gandalf, too, was lying down after doing his part in the setting the fire going, since Oin and Gloin had lost their tinder boxes. Dwarves have never taken to matches events even yet. So ended the adventures of the Misty Mountains. Soon Bilbo's stomach was feeling full and comfortable again, and he felt he could sleep contentedly, though really he would have liked a loaf of butter better than bits of meat toasted on sticks. He slept curled up on the hard rock more soundly than ever he had done in his feather bed in his own little hole at home. But all night he dreamt of his own house and wandered in his sleep into all his different rooms, looking for something that he could not find, nor remember what it looked like. Вот, конец главы. Юля, приветствую. Ну, мы уже здоровались. За картинку спасибо. У меня чайная пауза. Так, час читала. Ну, в принципе, да, еще 1 час. Наверное. Пробьерно. И так далее. И я за чаем. А у вас тут флоры. И котик. Ну и ножки размять. Да, антракт. О, Татьяна, ну вот отлично, за 2 главу вы берете 2 половину квартиры. О, самолет. Потягушечки. Я как раз уборкой с утра занялась, чтобы уже потом по этому поводу не париться. Сесть почитать, а потом уже дальше дела делать учебные. Вот. Дрозды. Кстати, дрозды перестали прилетать. Я уже давно не видела. Но я, конечно, чуть поменьше стала корма класть, чтобы они это все-таки слишком-то не привыкали. Орхидея в коконе-то нормально поживает. Жива, как минимум. Сейчас покажу ее. Но, кстати, не знаю, реально давно дростов не видела. Зато как-то раз зарянка прилетела. По-моему, зарянка. Ну, или малиновка. Только когда она была немножко, ну, не тощая, ну, такая стройная. Потому что к зарянкам я привыкла, что они довольно-таки пухленькие. Но, может быть, это когда совсем зима-зима, и они распушаются, да, они чуть более пухленькие. А это была, ну, может, молодая какая-нибудь, не знаю. Так, что орхидея где-то. Где-то она здесь рядом есть. Вот. Вот. Ша. Видно? Видно. Ну, я мох. Она все еще тяжелая, то есть ком земли все еще влажный. Я ее снаружи только опрыскиваю, чтобы мох не пересыхал. Хотя он... у меня так сухо в комнате, что его надо постоянно опрыскивать для этого. Ну, более-менее. Ну, тяжелая еще. Так что, я думаю, недельку еще постоит без полива. Точно, ананасик. Есть немножко. Ну, пока не жалуется, но, с другой стороны, орхидея медленно реагирует на окружающие перемены. Вот. Так что будем наблюдать. Там можно попрыскать. Еще мне пора тыкву пересаживать, в принципе. Там уже пошли первые полноценные листочки. Ну, пожалуй, не сегодня, или попозже. О, Кайс, привет. Да чего переживать, все будет нехорошо. Лучше за нее просто радуйтесь, наверное. Ай, я тут эту тилантию выловила из аквариума. Кстати, там у меня это растение вроде как живет, но у меня там водоросли поселились. Ой, да, с ними тоже надо будет еще что-то сделать. Ой, ой, ой. Нет, тилантия, не ломайся, пожалуйста. Вот. Это, конечно, все очень мило, но там, да, я аквариум пока что особо не трогаю. Даю этому растению шанс хоть как-то более-менее прийти в себя. И оно вроде как начало разрастаться дальше. Как его зовут-то? Забыла уже. гемиантус. Вот, если его не трогать, он вроде хорошо себя чувствует. Просто надо как-то придумать, как его вообще приклеить нормально к дну, чтобы он не плавал. Потому что каждый раз, когда я воду меняю, он весь расползается, распадается и так далее. Поэтому я сейчас просто сверху воды доливаю ему. Ну, вообще, по-хорошему, надо, конечно, там все помыть. Ай, ну да. Я читаю, что происходит. Ну, просто так. Во-первых, основная масса, ну, основная компания, в принципе, уже давно перестала прилетать, даже когда еда была. Вот, то есть я регулярно им клала эти шарики жировые, и арахис тоже насыпала. Вот, потом решила попробовать засыпать им орех, фундук, ну, который я из мюсли вылавливала, просто его раздавливала и клала тоже в кормушку, но что-то им орех не пошел. Главное, арахис они любят, а лесной орех типа нет. Окей. При том, что здесь внизу растет лесной орех, ну, может, они его в принципе не едят. Хотя, с другой стороны, почему они тогда арахис любят? Как бы арахис-то здесь точно не растет и, в принципе, никак вообще в природе не встречается. Ну да ладно. Вот, то есть у меня был момент такой, типа, либо вы едите лесной орех, либо вы идете это самое, ищете что-нибудь другое. И, видимо, они решили, ну и ладно, раз ты нам даешь только лесной орех и мне больше не даешь арахис, то и полетели мы отсюда. В общем, план по возвращению дроздов на природный корм, кажется, сработал. Ну, как бы, да, там арахис, в принципе, все еще лежит, если что. Потому что один вот самец, он реально, он подсел. Он такой, а зачем мне что-либо искать? Тут вот есть постоянный корм, давайте я буду здесь просто тусить постоянно, прилетать, есть, корми меня, женщина. Ну, как бы, не, все хорошо, я тебя буду кормить зимой, когда тебе действительно что-то сложно найти, и ты все равно здесь живешь. Но летом, ну или весной сейчас уже пошли вовсю насекомые, ласточки вернулись, ну, не очень активно, но я их видела, когда я их видела, 5 числа. Нет, стоп, не 5. Или 5. Ну, короче, недавно. Вот. Да, точно 5 в пятницу. Так что... Ну и к тому же другие-то перестали прилетать, значит, они уже где-то находят еду. Это такой хитропопый был. Ну, если ко мне сова прилетит, я скажу ей, о, круто, сова, и все. И порадуюсь, что она ко мне прилетела. И она как прилетела, так и улетит, скорее всего. Ну, или поймает какого-нибудь дрозда, хотя они вроде, я не знаю, охотятся они на птичек или нет. Ну, наверное, охотятся. Вот. Потому что заморозки у меня дома нет. Только курица. Курица это не очень здорово, потому что в ней, кроме нас, нет ничего. Кстати, к приятельнице прилетела пустельга на балконе посидеть. Она ее сфоткала. Вот. И, собственно, фотку я даже в группу кидала. Ну, фотку мне послала, я дальше к вам прислала. Так что, да, птички периодически прилетают, даже хищники. О, Сергей Псай, привет. Давно не виделись. Что-то у меня нос заложен опять. Вообще, если честно, я не уверена, что здесь очень много сов. Вот в целом. Потому что, ну, не знаю, всякие коршуны, да, здесь водятся, сокола разные, да. А сов, ну, в зоопарке, да, они есть. А вот насчет лесов я честно не знаю. Днем их, в принципе, наверное, не особо слышно. Вечером, ночью я как-то не гуляла. Но я слышала что-то похожее, возможно, на сову, но не факт, что это была сова. Могли быть какие-нибудь сойки или еще кто-нибудь. Сойки здесь есть, да. Всякие вороны, вороны тоже есть. Совы, хрен их знает. Потому что я даже читала сайты хайтовические всякие местные. И как-то про сов писали, что они встречаются, да, но не особо много. И так. Что, кстати, грустно. Или обидно. Хочется. Было прикольно, если бы они тут прям вот водились. Не знаю, может, каких-нибудь национальных парках, где людей поменьше. С другой стороны, они живут в центре Москвы, так что я думаю, наличие людей их не особо сильно смущает. Я имею в виду всякие парки посреди Москвы. Так что я не знаю. Я слушаю, что происходит снаружи. Или где-то сверху, снизу. Где-то. Соседи что-то делают. Топают. Сергей, вы одним глазом слушаете? Хорошо. Или одним глазом в чате, а так, в принципе, слушаете. Ладно. Поехали дальше, что ли? 12-минутной паузы. В принципе, достаточно, наверное. Так. Chapter 7. Queer lodgings. The next morning, Bilbo woke up with an early sun in his eyes. He jumped up to look at the time and to go back to put his kettle on, and found he was not home at all. So he sat down and wished in vain for a wash and a brush. He did not get either nor tea, nor toast, nor bacon for his breakfast, only cold mutton and rabbit. And after that, he had to get ready for the fresh start. This time he was allowed to climb onto the eagle's back and clinch between his wings. The air rushed over him as he shut his eyes. The dwarves were crying farewells and promising to repay the Lord of the Eagles if ever they could. As off rose 15 great birds from the mountainside. The sun was still close to the eastern edge of the Things. The morning was cool, and mists were in the valleys and hollows, and twined here and there about the peaks and pinnacles of the hills. Bilbo opened his eyes to peep and saw that the birds were already high up, and the world was far away, and the mountains were falling back behind them into the distance. He shut his eyes again and held on tighter. "Don't pinch," said the eagle. "You need not be frightened like a rabbit, even if you look rather like one. It is a fair morning with little wind. What is finer than flying?" Bilbo would have liked to say a warm bath and late breakfast on a lawn afterwards. But he thought it better to say nothing at all, and to let go his clutch just a tiny bit. After a good while, the eagles must have seen the point they were making for, even from their great height, for they began to go down, circling round in great spirals. They did this for a long while, and at last the hobbit opened his eyes again. The earth was much nearer, and below them were trees that looked like oaks and elms, and wide grasslands, and a river running through it all. But cropping out on the ground, right in the path of the stream, which looped itself about it, was a great rock, almost a hill of stone, like a last outpost of the distant mountains, or a huge piece cast miles into the plain by some giant among giants. Quickly now, to the top of this little rock, the eagles swooped one by one and set down their passengers. "Farewell," they cried, "wherever you fare, till your eyes receive you at the journey's end." That is the polite thing to say among eagles. "May the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks," answered Gandalf, who knew the correct reply. О, крутая картинка. Прям красивенько. Тут просто дальше название картинка. Bilbo woke up with the early sun in his eyes. Okay. And so they parted. And though the Lord of the Rings became in after days the king of all birds and wore a golden crown, and his 15 chieftains golden collars made of the gold that the dwarves gave them, Bilbo never saw them again, except high and far off the battle of 5 armies. But, as that comes in at the end of this tale, we will say no more about it just now. Такой спойлер вообще посреди книжки. Ну, в смысле, Толкин сам спойлер сделал. Типа, ну чё, там еще бэтл будет, в смысле, сражение. Okay. There is a flat space on the top of the hill of stone, and a well-worn path with many steps leading down it to the river, across which a ford of huge flat stones led to the grassland beyond the stream. There was a little cave, a wholesome one with a pebbly floor at the foot of the steps, and near the end of the stony ford. Here the party gathered and discussed what was to be done. "I always meant to see you all safe, if possible, over the mountains," said the wizard. "And now, by good management and good luck, I have done it. Indeed, we are now a good deal further east than I ever meant to come with you, for after all, this is not my adventure. I may look in on it again before it is all over, but in the meanwhile, I have to do other pressing business to attend to. I have some other pressing business to attend to." The dwarves groaned and looked most distressed, and Bilbo wept, and they began to think Gandalf was going to come. They had begun to think Gandalf was going to come all the way and would always be there to help them out of difficulties. I'm not going to disappear this very instant," he said. "I can give you a day or 2 more. Probably I can help you out of your present plight, and I need a little help myself. We have no food, and no baggage, and no ponies to ride, and you don't know where you are. Now I can tell you that. You are still some miles north of the path which we should have been following, if we had not left the mountain pass in a hurry. Very few people live in these parts, unless they have come here since I was last down this way, which is some years ago. But there is somebody that I know of who lives not far away. That somebody made the steps on the great rock, the Carrock, I believe he calls it. He does not come here often, certainly not in the daytime, and it is no good waiting for him. In fact, it would be very dangerous. We must go and find him.
and if all goes well at our meeting, I think I shall be off and wish you, like the eagles, farewell wherever you fare." They begged him not to leave him. They offered him dragon gold and silver and jewels, but he would not change his mind. We shall see, he said. And I think I have earned already some of your dragon golds when you have got it. After that, they stopped bleeding. Then they took off their clothes and bathed in the river, which was shallow and clear and stony at the ford. When they had dried in the sun, which was now strong and warm, they were refreshed, if still sore and a little hungry. Soon they crossed the ford, carrying the Hobbit, and then began to march through the long green grass and down the lines of wide-armed oaks and the tall elms. "And why is it called the Carrog?" asked Bilbo as he went along the wizard's side. He called it the Carrog because Carrog it is in his word. Because Carrog is the word for it. Is his word for it. He calls things like that Carrogs, and this one is the Carrog because it is the only one near his home, and he knows it well. Who is it? Who calls it? Who knows it? This somebody I spoke of, a very great person. You must all be very polite when I introduce you. I shall introduce you slowly, 2 by 2, I think. And you must be careful not to annoy him, or heavens knows what will happen. He can be a paling when he is angry, though he is kind enough if humoured. Still, I warn you, he gets angry easily." The dwarves all gathered round when they heard the wizard talking like this to Bilbo. Is that the person you're taking us to now?" they asked. "Could you find somebody more easy-tempered? Hadn't you better explain it all a bit clearer?" And so on. "Yes, it certainly is. No, I could not. And I was explaining very carefully," answered the wizard crossly. "If you must know more, his name is Bjorn. He is very strong, and he is a skin changer." "What? A furrier, a man that calls rabbits conies when he doesn't turn their skins into squirrels?" asked Bilbo. "Good gracious heavens, no, said Gandalf. "Don't be a fool, Mr. Baggins, if you can help it. And in the name of all wonder, don't mention the word furrier against as long as you're within 100 miles of his home. No rug, cape, tippet, muff, nor any other such unfortunate word. He's a skin changer. He changes his skin. Sometimes he is a huge black bear, sometimes he is a great, strong, black-haired man with huge arms and a great beard. I cannot tell you much more, though that ought to be enough. Some say that he is a bear descended from the great and ancient bears of the mountains, and lived there before the giants came. Others say that he is a man descended from the first man who lived before Smaug, or the other dragons came into this part of the world, and before the goblins came into the hills of the north, out of the north. I cannot say, though I fancy that the last is true tale. He is not the sort of person to ask questions of. At any rate, he is under no enchantment but his own. He lives in an oak wood, and has a great wooden house. And as a man he keeps cattle and horses, which are nearly as marvelous as himself. They work for him and talk to him. He does not eat them, neither does he hunt or eat wild animals. He keeps hives and hives of great fierce bees, and lives both on cream and honey. As a bear, he ranges far and wide. I once saw him sitting all alone on the top of the Carrack at night, watching the moon sinking towards the misty mountains, and I heard him growl in the tongue of bears. The day will come when they will perish, and I shall go back. That is why I believe he once came from the mountains himself. Bilbo and the dwarfs had now plenty to think about, and they asked no more questions. They still had a long way to walk before them. Up slope and down dale they plodded. It grew very hot. Sometimes they rested under the trees, and then Bilbo felt so hungry that he would have eaten acorns if they had been ripe enough yet to have fallen to the ground. It was the middle of the afternoon before they noticed that great patches of flowers had begun to spring up, all the same kinds growing together as if they had been planted. Especially the rose clover, waving patches of cockcombs clover and purple clover, and wide stretches of short white sweep, honey-smelling clover. There was a buzzing and whirring and droning in the air. Bees were busy everywhere, and such bees! Bilbo had never seen anything like them. If one was to sting me, he thought, I should swell up as big again as I am. They were bigger than hornets. The drones were bigger than your thumb, a good deal, and the bands of yellow on their deep black bodies shone like fiery gold. We are getting near, said Gandalf. We are on the edge of his speed pastures. After a while, they came to a belt of tall and very ancient oaks, and beyond these to a high thorn edge through which you could neither see nor scramble. You had better wait here, said the wizard to the dwarfs, and when I call or whistle, begin to come after me. You will see the way I go, but only in pairs, mind. About 5 minutes between each pair of you. Bomber is fattest and will go for 2. He had better come alone at last. Come on, Mr. Baggins. There's a gate somewhere around this way. And with that, he went off along the hedge, taking the frightened hobbit with him. They soon came to a wooden gate, high and broad, beyond which they could see gardens and a cluster of low wooden buildings, some thatched and made of unshaped logs, barns, stables, sheds, and a long, low wooden house. Inside, on the southward side of the great hedge, were rows and rows of hives with bell-shaped tops made of straw. The noise of the giant bees flying to and fro and crawling in and out filled all the air. Да, Сергей, здоровья и долгих лет техники вам. Ну, в смысле, жизни и вашей техники. Ну, и вам тоже. Спасибо за картинку, Эдвард. Тут новое скоро будет. Bjorn's Hall. Вообще он... Ну, я его Bjorn произношу по привычке. Ну, потому что шведское имя или норвежское имя есть Bjorn. А вообще, по идее, он должен быть Beorn. То есть там ударение, ну, в смысле, Beorn. Ну, ладно. Beorn. Попробуй правильно произносить. The wizard and the hobbit pushed open the heavy creaking gates and went down a wide track towards the house. Some horses, very sleek and well-groomed, trotted up across the grass and looked at them intently with their intelligent faces. Then off they galloped to the buildings. They have gone to tell him of our arrival of the arrival of strangers, said Gandalf. Soon they reached a courtyard, 3 walls of which were formed by the wooden house and its 2 long wings. In the middle there was lying a great oak trunk, with many lopped branches beside it. Standing near was a huge man with a thick black beard and hair, and great bare arms and legs with knotted muscles. He was clothed in a tunic of wool down. He was clothed in a tunic of wool down to his knees, and was leaning on a large axe. The horses were standing by him with their noses at his shoulder. "Ugh, here they are," he said to the horses. "They don't look dangerous. How can you can be off?" He laughed a great rolling laugh, put down his axe, and came forward. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he asked gruffly, standing in front of them and towering tall above Gandalf. As for Bilbo, he could easily have trotted through his legs without tucking his head to miss the fringe of the man's brown tunic. "I am Gandalf," said the wizard. "Never heard of him," growled the man. "And what's this little fellow?" he said, stooping down to frown at the hobbits with his bushy black eyebrows. "That is Mr. Baggins, a hobbit of good family, and an unimpeachable reputation," said Gandalf. Bilbo bowed. He had no hat to take off, and was painfully conscious of his many missing buttons. "I am a wizard," continued Gandalf. "I've heard of you if you have not heard of me. But perhaps you have heard of my good cousin Radagast, who lives near the southern borders of Mirkwood." "Yes, not a bad fellow as wizards go, I believe. I used to see him now and again," said Beorn. "Well, now, I know who you are, or what you say you are. What do you want?" "To tell you the truth, we have lost our luggage and nearly lost our way, and we're rather in need of help, or at least of advice. I may say we have had rather a bad time with goblins in the mountains." "Goblins," said the big man less gruffly. "Oh, so you've been having troubles with them, have you? What did you go near them for?" "We did not mean to. They surprised us at night in a pass which we had to cross. We were coming out of the lands over west into these countries, and it's a long tale." "Then you had better come inside and tell me some of it if it won't take all day," said the man, leading the way through the dark door that opened out to the courtyard into the house. Following him, they found themselves in a wide hall with a fireplace in the middle. Though it was summer, there was a wood fire burning, and the smoke was rising to the blackened rafters in search of the way out through an opening in the roof. They passed through this dim hall, lit only by the fire and the hall above it, and came through another small door into a soft sort of veranda, propped on wooden posts made of single tree trunks. It faced south and was still warm and filled with the light of the westering sun, which slanted slanted into it, and fell golden on the garden full of flowers that came right up to the steps. Okay. Here they sat on wooden benches while Gandalf began his tale, and Bilbo swung his dangling legs and looked at the flowers in the garden, wondering what their names could be, as he had never seen half of them before. I was coming over the mountains with a friend or two, said the wizard. Or two? I can only see one, and a little one at that, said Beorn. Well, to tell you the truth, I did not like to bother you with a lot of us until I found out if you were busy. I will give them a call, if I may. Go on, call away. So Gandalf gave a long, shrill whistle, and presently Thorin and Dori came round the house by the garden path and stood bowing low before them. One or three, you meant, I see, said Beorn. But these aren't hobbits, they're dwarves. Thorin Oakenshield at your service. Dori at your service, said the two dwarves, bowing again. I don't need your service, thank you, said Beorn. But I expect you need mine. I am not over fond of dwarves. But if it is true that you're Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thor, I believe, and that your companions is respectable, and that you're enemies of goblins, and they're not up to any mischief in my lands. What are you up to, by the way? They're on their way to visit the land of their fathers, away east beyond Mirkwood, put in Gandalf. And it is entirely an accident that we are in your lands at all. We were crossing by the high pass that should have brought us to the road that lies to the south of your country, when we were attacked by the evil goblins, as I was about to tell you. Go on telling them, said Beorn, who was never very polite. There was a terrible storm. The stone giants were out hurling rocks, and at the head of the pass, we took refuge in a cave. The Hobbit and I and several of our companions. Do you call two several? Well, no. As a matter of fact, there were more than two. Where are they? Killed, eaten, gone home? Well, no. They don't seem all to have come when I whistled. Shy, I expect. You see, we're very much afraid that we're rather a lot for you to entertain. Go on, whistle again. I am in for a party, it seems, and one or two more won't make much difference, growled Beorn. Gandalf whistled again, but Nori and Ori were there almost before he had stopped, for, if you remember, Gandalf had told them to come in pairs every 5 minutes. Hello, said Beorn, you came pretty quick. Where were you hiding? Come on, my jack in the boxes. Nori at your service, Ori at, they began, but Beorn interrupted them. Thank you. When I want your help, I will ask for it. Sit down and let's get on with this tale, or it will be supper time before it is ended. As soon as we were asleep, went on Gandalf, a crack at the back of the cave opened. Goblins came out and grabbed the hobbit and the dwarves and our troop of ponies. Troop of ponies? What are you, a traveling circus? Or were you carrying lots of goods? Or do you always call 6 a troop? Oh no. As a matter of fact, there were more than 6 ponies, for there were more than 6 of us, and, well, here are 2 more. Just at that moment, Balin and Dwalin appeared and bowed so low their beards swept the stone floor. The big man was frowning at first, but they did their best to be frightfully polite and kept on nodding and bending and bowing and waving their hooves before their knees in proper dwarf fashion, till he stopped frowning and burst into a chuckling laugh. They looked so comical. "Truth was right," he said, "a fine comic one. Come in, my merry man, and what's your names? I don't want your service just now, only names. And then sit down and stop wagging." "Balin and Dwalin," they said, not daring to be offended, and sat flop on the floor, looking rather surprised. "Now, go on again," said Bjorn to the wizard. "Where was I? Oh, yes, I was not grabbed. I killed a goblin or two with a flash." "Good," growled Bjorn. "It is some good being a wizard then," and slipped inside the crack before it closed. I followed down into the main hall, which was crowded with goblins. The great goblin was there with 30 or 40 armed guards. I thought to myself, even if they were not all chained together, what can a dozen do against so many? A dozen? That is the first time I've heard 8 called a dozen. Or have you still got some more jacks that haven't yet come out of their boxes? Well, yes. There seem to be a couple more here now. Phil and Killer, I believe, said Gandalf, as these two now appeared and stood smiling and bowing. "That's enough," said Bjorn. "Sit down and be quiet. Now go on, Gandalf." So Gandalf went on with his tale until he came to the flights in the dark, the discovery of the lower gate, and their horror when they found that Mr. Baggins had been mislaid. We counted ourselves and found that there was no Hobbit. There were only 14 of us left. 14? That's the first time I've heard one from 10 leave 14. You mean 9, or else you haven't told me yet all of your names of your party. Well, of course you haven't seen Oin and Gloin yet. And bless me, here they are. I hope you will forgive them for bothering you. Oh, let them all come. Hurry up, come along, you two, and sit down. But look here, Gandalf, even now we have only got yourself and 10 dwarves and the Hobbit that was lost. That only makes 11, plus 1 mislaid, and not 14 unless wizards count differently to other people. But now, please get on with the tale. Bjorn did not show it more than he could help, but really, he had begun to get very interested. You see, in the old days, he had known the very part of the mountains that Gandalf was describing. He nodded and he growled when he heard of the Hobbit's reappearance and of their scramble down the stone slide of the wolf and of the wolf ring in the woods. When Gandalf came to their climbing into trees, with the wolves all underneath, he got up and strode about and muttered, "I wish I had been there. I would have given them more than fireworks." "Well," said Gandalf, very glad to see that his tale was making a good impression, "I did the best I could. There we were with the wolves going mad underneath us and the forest beginning to blaze in places, when the goblins came down from the hills and discovered us. They yelled with delight and sang songs making fun of us. 15 birds and 5 fir trees. Good heavens, growled Bjorn. Don't pretend that goblins can't count. They can. 12 isn't 15, and they know it. And so do I. There were Biffer and Boffer as well. I haven't ventured to introduce them before, but here they are. In came Biffer and Boffer, and me, gasped Bomber, puffing in behind. He was fat and also angry at being left till last. He refused to wait 5 minutes and followed immediately after the two others. Well, now there are 15 of you, and since goblins can count, I suppose that is all that there were up the trees. Now, perhaps we can finish the story without any more interruptions. Mr. Baggins saw there then how clever Gandalf had been. The interruptions had really made Bjorn more interested in the story, and the story had kept him from sending the dwarves off at once like suspicious beggars. He never invited people into his house if he could help it. He had very few friends, and they lived a good way away. And he never invited more than a couple of these to his house at a time. Now he had got 15 strangers sitting in his porch. By the time the wizard had finished his tale and had told of the eagle's rescue and of how they had all been brought to the Carrock, the sun had fallen behind the peaks of the misty mountains, and the shadows were long in Beorn's garden. "A very good tale," said he, "the best I have heard for a long while. If all beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. You may be making it all up, of course, but you deserve a supper for the story all the same. Let's have something to eat." "Yes, please," they all said together. "Thank you very much." Inside the hall, it was now quite dark. Beorn clapped his hands, and in trotted 4 beautiful white ponies and several large, long-bodied grey dogs. Beorn said something to them in a queer language, like animal noises turned into talk. They went out again, and soon came back carrying torches in their mouths, which they lit at the fire and stuck into low brackets on the pillars of the hall about the central hearth. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished, and carry things with their 4 feet. Quickly they got out boards and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. Then "ba ba ba" was heard, and then came some snow-white sheep led by a large coal-black ram. One bore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Others bore on their broad backs trays with bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took and quickly laid on trestle tables. These were very low enough even for Bilbo to sit at comfortably. Besides them, a pony pushed 2 low-seated benches and wide rush bottoms, and little short thick legs for Gandalf and Thorin, while at the far end he put Beorn's big black chair of the same sort, in which he sat with his great legs stuck far out under the table. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had of them low like the tables, for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. What did the rest sit on? They were not forgotten. The other ponies came in rolling round drum-shaped sections of logs, smoothed and polished, and low enough even for Bilbo. So soon they were all seated at Beorn's table, and the hall had not seen such a gathering for many a year. There they had a supper or a dinner such as they had not had since they left the last homely house in the west and said goodbye to Elrond. The light of the torches and the fire flickering about them, and on the table were two tall red beeswax candles. All the time they ate, Beorn and his deep rolling voice told tales of the wild lands on this side of the mountains, and especially of the dark and dangerous wood that lay outstretched far to north and south, a day's ride before them, barring their way to the east, the terrible forest of Mirkwood. The dwarfs listened and shook their heads, for they knew that they must soon venture into that forest, and that after the mountains it was the worst of the perils they had to pass before they came to the dragon's stronghold. When dinner was over, they began to tell tales of their own, but Beorn seemed to be growing drowsy and paid little heed to them. They spoke most of gold and silver and jewels, and the making of things by smithcraft, and Beorn did not appear to care for such things. There were no things of gold or silver in his hall, and few save the knives were made of metal at all. They sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. The dark night came on outside. The fires in the middle of the hall were built with fresh logs, and the torches were put out. And still they sat in the light of the dancing flames, with the pillars of the house standing tall behind them, and dark at the top like trees of the forest. Whether this was magic or not, it seemed to Bilbo that he heard a sound like wind in the branches stirring in the rafters, and the hoot of owls. Soon he began to nod with sleep, and the voices seemed to grow far away, until he woke with a start. The great door had creaked and slammed. Beorn was gone. The dwarfs were sitting cross-legged on the floor around the fire, and presently they began to sing. Some of the verses were like this, but there were many more, and their singing went on for a long while.
Прежде чем я буду петь или пытаться прочесть, нужна чайная подзарядка. Окей, это немножко другая песня. Как будто бы. Ну ладно. Ну или она по-другому начинается. Ну или я что-то прослушала. Ладно. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. Their shallow... так нет, ладно. Заново. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. Their shadows lay by night and day, the dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide of rooted and roared. Ёпсель. Так, ладно, не будем петь, будем просто читать. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled, chorus moans. The leaves were laid upon the mold.
The wind went on from west to east. All movements in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, o'er shaking pool under heaven's cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountains bare, and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the worlds and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. And stars were fanned to leaping light. Да, sorry, спеть не получилось. Bilbo began to nod again. Suddenly up stood Gandalf. "It is time for us to sleep," he said. "For us, but not, I think, for Beorn. In this hall we can rest sound and safe. But I warn you all not to forget what Beorn said before he left us. You must not stray outside until the sun is up, on your peril." Bilbo found that beds had already been laid at the side of the hall, on a sort of raised platforms between the pillars and the outer wall. For him there was a little mattress of straw and woolen blankets. He snuggled into them very gladly. Summertime though it was, the fire burned low, and he fell asleep. Yet in the night he woke. The fire had now sunk into a few embers. The dwarves and Gandalf were all asleep. To judge by their breathing, a splash of white on the floor came from the high moon, which was peering down through the smoke hole in the roof. There was a growling sound outside, and a noise as of some great animal scuffling at the door. Bilbo wondered what it was, and whether it could be Beorn in enchanted shape, and if he would come in as a bear and kill them. He dived under the blankets and hit his head, and fell asleep again at last in spite of his fears. It was full morning when he awoke. One of the dwarfs had fallen over him in the shadows where he lay, and had rolled down with a bump from the platform onto the floor. It was Boffer, and it was grumbling about it when Bilbo opened his eyes. "Get up, lazybones," he said, "or there will be no breakfast left for you." Up jumped Bilbo. "Breakfast?" he cried. "Where's breakfast?" "Mostly inside us," answered the other dwarfs, who were moving about the hall. "But what is left is out of on the veranda. We have been about looking for Beorn ever since the sun got up, but there is no sign of him anywhere, though we found breakfast laid as soon as we went out." "Where is Gandalf?" asked Bilbo, moving off to find something to eat as quick as he could. "Oh, out and about somewhere," they told him, but he saw no sign of the wizard all that day until the evening. Just before sunset, he walked into the hall, where the Hobbit and the dwarves were having supper, waited on by Beorn's wonderful animals, as they had been all day. Of Beorn they had seen and heard nothing since the night before, and they were getting puzzled. "Where is our host, and where have you been all day yourself?" they all cried. "One question at a time, and none till after supper. I haven't had a bit since breakfast." At last, Gandalf pushed away his plate and jug. He had eaten 2 whole loaves, with masses of butter and honey, and clotted cream, and drank at least a quarter of mead. And he took out his pipe. I will answer the second question first," he said. "But bless me, this is a splendid place for smoke rings." "Indeed, For a long time they could get nothing more out of him. He was so busy sending smoke rings, dodging round the pillars of the hall, changing them into all sorts of different shapes and colours, and setting them at last chasing one another out of the hole in the roof. They must have looked very queer from outside, popping out into the air, one after another, green, blue, red, silver grey, yellow, white, big ones, little ones dodging through big ones and joining into figure eights and going off like a flock of birds into the distance. I have been picking out bear tracks, he said at last. There must have been a regular bears meeting outside here last night. I soon saw that Bjorn could not have made all of them, or them all. There were far too many of them, and they were of various sizes too. I should say that there were little bears, large bears, ordinary bears, and gigantic big bears, all dancing outside from dark to nearly dawn. They came from almost every direction, except from the west over the river, from the mountains. In that direction, only one set of footprints led. None coming, only ones going away from here. I followed these as far as the Carragh. There they disappeared into the river, but the water was too deep and strong beyond the rock for me to cross. It is easy enough, as you remember, to get from this bank to the Carragh by the fort, but on the other side is a cliff standing up from a swirling channel. I had to walk miles before I found a place where the river was wide and shallow enough for me to wade and swim, and then miles back again to pick up the tracks again. By that time, it was too late for me to follow them far. They went straight off to the direction of the pine woods of the east side of the Misty Mountains, where we had our pleasant little party with the wargs the night before last. And now I think I have answered your first question too, ended Gandalf, and he sat a long while silent. Bilbo thought he knew what the wizard meant. What shall we do? He cried. If he leads the wargs and the goblins down here, we shall all be caught and killed. I thought you said he was not a friend of theirs. So I did, and don't be silly, you had better go to bed, your wits are sleepy. The hobbit felt quite crushed, and as there seemed nothing else to do, he did go to bed. And while the dwarfs were still singing songs, he dropped asleep, still puzzling his little heads about Beorn, till he dreamed a dream of hundreds of black bears dancing slow, heavy dances round and round in the moonlight in the courtyard. Then he woke up when everyone else was asleep, and he heard the same scrapping, scuffling, snuffling, and growling as before. Next morning, they were all wakened by Bjorn himself. So here you all are still, he said. He picked up the hobbit and laughed. Not eaten by the wargs or goblins or wicked bears yet, I see. And he poked Mr. Baggins' waistcoat most disrespectfully. Little bunny's getting nice and fat again on the bread and honey, he chuckled. Come and have some more. So they all went to breakfast with him. Bjorn was most jolly for a change. Indeed, he seemed to be in a splendidly good humour, and set them all laughing with his funny stories. Nor did they have to wonder long where he had been, or why he was so nice to them, for he told them himself. He had been over the river and right back up into the mountains, from which you can guess that he could travel quickly, in bear shape at any rate. From the burnt wolf glade, he had soon found out that a part of their story was true. But he had found more than that. He had caught a warg and a goblin wandering in the woods. From these he had got news. The goblins' patrols were still hunting with wargs for the dwarves, and they were fiercely angry because of the death of the great goblin, and also because of the burning of the chief wolf's nose, and the death from the wizard's fire of many of his chief servants. So much they told him when he forced them, but he guessed there were more wickedness than this afoot, and that a great raid of the whole goblin army and their wolf allies into the lands shadowed by the mountains might soon be made to find the dwarves, or to take vengeance on the man and creatures that lived there and who they thought must be sheltering them. It was a good story, that of yours, said Beorn. But I like it still better now that I am sure it is true. You must forgive me not taking your word. If you lived near the edge of the Mirkwood, you would take the word of no one that you did not know as well as your brother or better. As it is, I can only say that I have hurried home as fast as I could to see that you are safe and to offer you any help that I can. I shall think more kindly of dwarves after this. Kill the great goblin! Kill the great goblin! He chuckled fiercely to himself. What did you do with the goblin and the warg? Said Bilbo suddenly. Come out and see, said Beorn, as they followed round the house. A goblin's head was stuck outside the gate, and a warg's skin was nailed to the tree just beyond. Beorn was a fierce enemy, but now he was their friend, and Gandalf thought it wise to tell him their whole story and the reason of their journey, so that they could get the most help he could offer. This is what he promised to do for them. He would provide ponies for each of them, and a horse for Gandalf, for their journey to the forest, and he would lade them with food to last them for weeks with care, and packed so as to be as easy as possible to carry, nuts, flowers, sealed jars of dried fruit, and red earthened pots of honey, and twice baked cakes that would keep good a long time, and on a little of which they could march far. The making of these was one of his secrets, but honey was in them, as in most of his foods, and they were good to eat, though they made one thirsty. Water, he said, they would not need to carry this side of the forest, for there were streams and springs along the road. But your way through Mirkwood is dark, dangerous, and difficult, he said. Water is not easy to find there, nor food. The time is not yet come for nuts, though it may be past and gone inside, indeed, before you get to the other side. And nuts are abundant about all that grows there, fit for food. In there, the wild things are dark, queer, and savage. I will provide you with skins for carrying water, and I will give you some bows and arrows. But I doubt very much whether anything you find in Mirkwood will be wholesome to eat or drink. There is one stream there, I know, black and strong, which crosses the path. That you should never drink of, nor bathe in, for I have heard that it carries enchantment and a great drowsiness and forgetfulness. And in the dim shadows of that place, I don't think you will shoot anything, wholesome or unwholesome, which without straying from the path. That you must not do for any reason. That is all the advice I can give you. Beyond the edge of the forest, I cannot help you much. You must depend on your luck and your courage and the foot I stand with you. At the gate of the forest, I must ask you to send back my horse and my ponies. But I wish you all speed, and my house is open for you if ever you come back this way again. They thanked him, of course, with many bows and sweepings of their hoods, and with many an at your service, O master of the wild wooden halls. But their spirits sank at his grave words, as they all felt that the adventure was far more dangerous than they had thought, while all the time, even if they passed all the perils of the road, the dragon was waiting at the end. Ну вот. Вот это, как его, кардамон. All that morning they were busy with preparations. Soon after midday they ate with Beorn for the last time, and after the meal they mounted the steeds he was lending them, and bidding him many farewells they rode. And after the meal they mounted the steeds he was lending them, and after bidding him many farewells they rode off through his gate at a good pace. As soon as they left his high hedges at the east of his fenced lands, they turned north and then bore to the northwest. By his advice, they were no longer making for the main forest roads to the south of his land. Had they followed the pass, their path would have led them down a stream from the mountains that join the great river miles south of the Carrock. At that point, there was a deep ford which they might have passed if they had still had their ponies, and beyond that track led to the skirts of the wood and to the entrance of the old forest road. But Beorn had warned them that way was not now often used by the goblins, while the forest road itself, he said he had heard, was overgrown and disused at the eastern end, and led to impassable marshes where the paths had long been lost. Its eastern opening had also always been far from the south of the lonely mountain, and would have left them still with a long and difficult northward march when they got to the other side. North of the Carrock, the edge of Mirkwood drew closer to the borders of the great river, and though here the mountains too drew down nearer, Beorn advised them to take this way, for at a place a few days' ride due north to the Carrock was the gate of the little-known pathway through Mirkwood that led almost straight towards the lonely mountain. The goblins, Beorn said, will not dare to cross the great river for 100 miles north of the Carrock, nor come near my house. It is well protected at night. But I should ride fast, for if they make their raid soon, they will cross the river to the south and scour all the edge of the forest so as to cut you off, and wargs run swifter than ponies. Still, you are safer going north, even though you seem to be going back near to their strongholds, for that is what they will least expect, and they will have the longer rides to catch you. Be off now as quick as you may. That is why they were now riding in silence, galloping wherever the ground was grassy and smooth, with the mountains dark on their left, and in the distance, the line of the river with its trees drawing ever closer. The sun had only just turned west when they started. Until evening, it lay golden on the lands about them. It was difficult to think of pursuing goblins behind. It was difficult to think of pursuing. Дурацкое слово. Преследующие гоблины. Ладно. It was difficult to think of pursuing goblins behind, and then they had put many miles between them and Bjorn's house. They began to talk and to sing again, and to forget the dark forest path that lay in front. But in the evening, when the dusk came on and the peaks of the mountains glowered against the sunset, they made camp and set a guard. And most of them slept uneasy with dreams in which there came the howl of hunting wolves and the cries of goblins. Still, the next morning dawned bright and fair again. There was an autumn-like mist while upon the ground, and the air was chill, but soon the sun rose red in the east, and the mist vanished, and while the shadows were still long, they were off again. So they rode now and for 2 more days, and all the while they saw nothing save grass and flowers and birds and scattered trees, and occasionally small herds of red deer browsing or sitting at noon in the shade. Sometimes Bilbo saw the horns of the harts sticking up out of the long grass, and at first he thought they were the dead branches of trees. That third evening they were so eager to press on, for Beorn had said that they would reach the forest gate early on the 4th day, and they rode still forward after dusk and into the night beneath the moon. As the light faded, Bilbo thought he saw away to the right or to the left a shadowy form of a great bear prowling along in the same direction. But if he had dared to mention it to Gandalf, the wizard only said, "Hush, take no notice." Next day they started before dawn, though their nights had been short. As soon as it was light, they could see the forest coming as it were to meet them, or waiting for them like a black and frowning wall before them. The land began to slope up, and it seemed to the hobbits that the silence began to draw in upon them. Birds began to sing less. There were no more deer, not even rabbits were to be seen. By the afternoon, they had reached the eaves of Mirkwood, and were resting almost beneath the great overhanging boughs of its outer trees. Their trunks were huge and gnarled, their branches twisted, their leaves were dark and long. Ivy grew on them and trailed along the ground. "Well, here is Mirkwood," said Gandalf, "the greatest of the forests of the northern world. I hope you like the look of it. Now you must send back these excellent ponies you have borrowed." The dwarves were inclined to grumble at this, but the wizard told them they were fools. "Beorn is not as far off as you seem to think, and you had better kept your promises anyway, for he is a bad enemy. Mr. Baggins's eyes are sharper than yours. If you have not seen each night after dark a great bear going along with us, or sitting far, сообщение просто. Mr. Baggins's eyes are sharper than yours. If you have not seen each night after dark a great bear going along with us, or sitting far off in the moon watching our camps, not only to guard you and to guide you, but to keep an eye on the ponies too. Beorn may be your friend, but he loves his animals as his children. You do not guess what kindness he has shown you in letting dwarfs ride them so far and so fast, nor what would happen to you if you tried to take them into the forest. What about the horse then? Said Thorin. You don't mention sending that back. I don't, because I'm not sending it. What's about your promise then? I will look after that. I'm not sending the horse back, I'm riding it. Then they knew that Gandalf was going to leave them at the very edge of Mirkwood, and they were in despair, but nothing they could say would change his mind. Now we had this all our Now we had all this all out before when we landed on the Carrack, he said. It is no use arguing. I have, as I told you, some pressing business away south, and I'm already late through bothering with you people. We may meet again before all is over, and then again, of course, we may not. That depends on your luck and on your courage and sense. I am sending Mr. Baggins with you. I have told you before that he has more about him than you guessed, and you will find that out before long. So cheer up, Bilbo, and don't look so glum. Cheer up, Thorin and company. This is your expedition, after all. Think of the treasure at the end, and forget the forest and the dragon, at any rate until tomorrow morning. When tomorrow morning came, he still said the same. So now there was nothing left to do but to fill their water skins, and at a clear spring they found close to the forest gate, and unpacked the ponies. They distributed the packages as fairly as they could, though Bilbo thought his load was wearisomely heavy, and did not at all like the idea of trudging for miles and miles with all that on his back. Don't you worry, said Thorin. It will get lighter all too soon. Before long, I expect, we shall all wish our packs heavier when the food begins to run short. And then, at last, they said goodbye to their ponies and turned their heads for home. Off they trotted gaily, seeming very glad to put their tails towards the shadow of Mirkwood. As they went away, Bilbo could have sworn that a thing like a bear left the shadows of the trees and shambled off quickly after them. Now Gandalf too said farewell. Bilbo sat on the ground, feeling very unhappy, and wishing he was beside the wizard on his tall horse. He had gone just inside the forest after breakfast, a very cool one, and it had seemed as dark in there in the morning as at night, and very secret. A sort of watching and waiting feeling, he said to himself. Goodbye, said Gandalf to Thorin, and goodbye to you all. Goodbye, straight through the forest is your way now. Don't stray off the track. If you do, it is 1,000 to 1 that you will never find it again, and never get out of Mirkwood. And then I don't suppose I or anyone else will ever see you again. Do we really have to go through? Groaned the Hobbit. Yes, you do, said the Wizard. If you want to get to the other side, you must either go through or give up your quest. As I am not going to allow you to go back out now, Mr. Baggins. And I'm not going to allow you to go back out now, Mr. Baggins. I am ashamed of you thinking of it. You have got to look after all these dwarfs for me, he laughed. No, said Bilbo. I didn't mean that. I meant, is there no way round? There is, if you care to go 200 miles or so out of your way north, and twice that south. But you won't get a safe path there even then. There are no safe paths in this part of the world. Remember, you're over to the edge of the wild now, and in for all sorts of fun wherever you go. Before you could get around Mirkwood in the north, you would be right among the slopes of the Grey Mountains, and they're simply stiff with goblins, hobgoblins, and orcs of all the worst description. Before you could get rounded in the south, you would get into the land of Necromancer, and even you, Bilbo, won't need me to tell you tales of the Black Sorcerer. I don't advise you to go anywhere near the places overlooked by his dark towers. Stick to the forest track, keep your spirits up, hope for the best, and with a tremendous slice of luck you may come out one day and see the long marshes lying below you, and beyond them, high in the east, the lonely mountain where dear old Smaug lives, though I hope he is not expecting you. Very comforting you are, to be sure, groaned Thorin. Goodbye. If you won't come with us, you had better get off without any more talk. Goodbye then, and really goodbye, said Gandalf, and he turned his horse and rode down into the west. But he could not resist the temptation to have the last word. Before he had passed quite out of hearing, he turned and put his hands to his mouth and called for them. They heard his voice come faintly. Goodbye! Be good, take care of yourselves, and don't leave the path! Yay! So. Нет, черт. Тут очень маленькая картиночка. Я думала, это конец. В общем, тут есть маленькая картиночка Мирквуд. Лихолесье. Вот. Then he galloped away and was soon lost to sight. Oh, goodbye and go away, grunted the dwarfs, and more angry because all the more angry because they were really filled with dismay at losing him. Now began the most dangerous part of all the journey. They each shouldered the heavy bag and the water skin, which was their share, and turned from the lights that lay on the lands outside and plunged into the forest. Вот, теперь все. Ой, да, 1,5 часа бы нашло на эту главу. Ну да. Все, на сегодня точно. О, спасибо за картинку. О, господи, сколько всяких сообщений. Да, пожалуйста. Ну да, под конец я уже, как всегда, начала
спотыкаться, так скажем. Да, 2 главы подряд, это немножко это перебор. Вот. Но надеюсь, вам все равно было интересно. Не знаю, понравилось хоть чуть-чуть. Пожалуйста. Да, спасибо, я тоже за картинки. Надеюсь, вы их там смотрите иногда. А то что? Ну, отдыхать. Ну, как минимум, надо пообедать. А потом геометрия. Ей. Счастье, радость, блин. Помнишь мир. Спасибо за ссылку, Эдвард. Да уж, героически. Под конец было очень тяжко, вот заметно, да? Просто на каждом предложении спотыкаюсь. О, вы все-таки смотрели картинки? Круто. Ну, это перерывчик небольшой между первой и второй. Но это было между главами, сейчас между первой и второй активностью на сегодня. Перерывчик и дела. Да, и спасибо за пожелание, приятного аппетита. Да, спасибо. У нас, короче, это вот последний семестр получается. Вот, и геометрия — это, в принципе, мой последний предмет, который надо сдать. Там лекция с упражнением. И что-то как-то немного упражнений понакидали. Вот. Там надо еженедельно сдавать упражнения, каждые 2 недели тест. И так до конца семестра. Ну, там что-то 6 тестов. Ну да, как раз вот каждые 2 недели, 3 месяца. Нет, стоп, не 3 месяца, 2 месяца. Ну, да, 2. Вот, 2 месяца, видимо. И потом еще, блин, экзамен. Вот это меня немножко бесит. Хотя нет, кстати. Я не помню. Да, мы тут догнали Диму. Кое-как, но догнали. Интересно, свет прыгает. Когда я сюда поворачиваюсь, он фокусируется на мне. Когда я отворачиваюсь, он фокусируется там. Окей. Давай, Дима, удачи тебе. Блин, у нас по воскресенье все закрыто, поэтому у меня даже нет такой опции, чтобы пойти в магазин. А по субботам все закрывается в 6. Замечательно. Хорошо, что я входила в магазин в четверг. Ой. Листики падают. Вот. Так что, да, давайте прощаться тогда. Спасибо всем, что были. Вот. Еще, да, точно, я забыла именно эту ссылку, в смысле, ну да, ссылку на эти главы. У меня тут просто на первое чтение ссылка, вообще-то. Ну, я думаю, там по первой, если у Димы все это сложено в плейлист, то можно по первой ссылке найти все остальные главы. Тогда надо, в принципе, поменять ссылку. Вот. Потом, если что. Или ты ты прям ту самую нужную. Сейчас проверим. Круто. Прям вот та самая ссылка, которая нужна. Круто, Эдвард, спасибо тебе большое. Сейчас заодно подправим описание. Ей, что отправила. Вот. Так что да. Всем спасибо, что тут были. Спасибо за котиков, Татьяна и Малик. И я думаю, вроде ничего не пропустила, потому что я не до конца... Сова не прилетала, Малик, извини. Там, по-моему, вороны налетали. Я просто, когда читала, видела такую краем глаза большую тень. То ли на стене, то ли где-то еще на шкафу. Да, точно, у меня же шкаф отражает то, что сзади. В общем, да. Я тут читаю про орлов, а у меня птички летают. Большие. Прости, совы не было. Да, кстати, точно готовить. Ну, нет, кстати, сегодня вроде особо ничего готовить не надо. Правда, на завтра надо. Точно, надо еще пирожок, тортик в духовку поставить. В общем, куча дел. Надо вот прощаться. Я уже 3-й раз об этом говорю. Всем хорошего дня. Спасибо, что были. Вот, спасибо, что слушаете. Я надеюсь, вы хоть что-то понимаете, что вам интересно. Вот. Ну или хотя бы есть подо что дела делать. И вообще, чтобы котики хорошие. Такие приходят постоянно. Несмотря на всякие косяки с чтением и так далее. Так что да, всем хорошего воскресенья. С праздником завтрашним. Всех. Как девушек, так не девушек. Вот. И до встречи. Надеюсь, получится на следующих выходных почитать тоже. Посмотрим. Ну, я думаю, получится. Уже 2 часа в выходные я найду. 3 часа, ладно. Я найду, чтобы что-то поделать приятного. Все. Всем спасибо. Живите долго, процветайте. И пока-пока.